Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, for the 5th anniversary of the latest game from Quantic Dream up to this point, here I'll be talking about my thoughts on Detroit Become Human, which is probably their best game yet. Now this is coming from someone who played a ridiculous amount of Heavy Rain, and Detroit very much feels like a spiritual successor to Heavy Rain. Much more so than their previous game in Beyond Two Souls, and I do feel like Detroit is an improvement upon the Heavy Rain formula in every conceivable way. The characters and the world building feel more developed, the writing and dialogue is just outright better, the acting is vastly improved, the choices are made to me more important, increasing the overall scale of the game, all while keeping the gameplay mostly the same, keeping the multiple playable protagonists, each of them being compelling in their own rights, and also showing radically different points of view of this human-android conflict. Though it doesn't mean that this game is flawless. I mean, far from it, where, again, this game does still suffer from the typical tropes of David Cage's writing, who can't help but add in this extra dose of melodrama and some blatant thematic messaging that still ends up bogging this game down. Though again, I do still think this game shows a steady upward trajectory for David Cage's writing, and also the overall quality of the type of game that Quantic Dream makes. But like my other Quantic Dream retrospectives, I'll be running through the game chapter by chapter, though first I do want to talk about some more general things. Now again, this game does play similarly to Heavy Rain, keeping a lot of its core mechanics. It is still this interactive drama style of adventure game that handles its action sequences with QuickTime events to the point where failing them can lead to your character dying, with this game continuing David Cage's no game over screen philosophy, and that the story will just progress without that character, though there is a major caveat to that which we will talk about. Though in general, this game does have a wider range of branching storylines, particularly towards the end of the game. And to match that, the game does include flowcharts to allow you to see the different ways a chapter can wind up, which the inclusion of these actually did lead to this being one of my most played games on the PS4, where outside of these massive open world RPGs, I've played Detroit more than most other games from the last generation. Not just from doing the platinum, which in itself does take a decent amount of time due to you having to find all of the magazine collectibles that differ due to previous decisions, making you have to replay numerous sections to do it, which is annoying, but also from me attempting to complete all of the flowcharts. And this is just a ridiculous feat that I never ended up finishing, only getting up to the Public Enemy chapter, which is where it starts to get extremely tedious with just how many minute things end up affecting other things. Though I still had a lot of fun replaying these chapters just to reveal all these different scenarios that can happen. Now beyond that, I do think this game handles its multiple playable characters way better than it was done in Heavy Rain, where a criticism of mine there is how Ethan Mars felt like the only protagonist integral to the core narrative. And while you can make the same argument for Marcus here, I do feel like the other two playable characters here add a greater depth to this game that simply wasn't there in Heavy Rain, with Conor showing the perspective of an android initially siding with the humans, while Cara shows the conflict from an outside perspective, and is used to really emphasize the theme of humanity within these androids. And through that, again, it made these characters feel like they mattered, even though really for the main plot, they don't, especially Cara, who by the end of the game you do notice is just simply there. Each of these sections do feel very unique to each other as well, even in how they're portrayed, with each character getting their own composer, which is a nice little touch. And obviously you have radically different gameplay styles, with Cara typically being on the run and most of her gameplay being based around finding safety for Alice. You have Marcus's sections that are a lot more action heavy and also add in some parkour based puzzle like sections. Well, Conor has the most interesting gameplay style to me, of it feeling like an improvement upon Norman Jayden's gameplay from Heavy Rain, with these sections typically comprising of investigations. Though again, a bit more refined, but also a bit more failable. Though it adds in new mechanics here, like being able to reconstruct events, and also there's this Eagle Vision style mechanic where these androids can see all the interactable objects in the area, and that helps out with these sections. But the final general thing I want to talk about here is something that is actually a really interesting aspect of this game, despite it being so minor, and that is the main menu, which has you interacting with an android named Chloe, who acts as our hostess. But a nice little detail here is how she develops over the course of the story, where again, some of it can come off as very heavy-handed, with it feeling like developers telling you how you should feel during certain moments, though it is a unique addition here that does show that they really cared about the level of immersion that this experience is supposed to exude, with this menu feeling like it's in-universe. And at the end of the game, you're given the opportunity to set her free, which again fully fits within the themes of the story. But I'll start running through the game, starting off with the prologue, that being the hostage chapter, which is a fantastic intro to this game, with it instantly putting you in control of Conor, with him instantly being characterized as this cold robotic figure, being the initial assumption of what an android would be, with him playing around with this coin with precision, though then we find out that he has been brought here to talk down a deviant android from killing a little girl, where we see the girl's mother freak out over an android being brought in, instantly showing the discrimination against androids here, and right away we do get a choice of whether or not to save a fish on the floor, feeling like this metaphor for Conor's struggles with his humanity, which these struggles typically affect his software instability, which is this in-game tracker of that. And again, Conor is a massive highlight across this game, being the character that develops the most over the course of its narrative, with Conor's journey to becoming a deviant being the most compelling part of the narrative. And he is also very well portrayed by Brian Deckard, who I think has this perfect mix of stiffness due to your character being a robot, but still being able to exude emotion despite that. But this section does give us our first investigation section, where we can learn more about the deviant, which will open up helpful dialogue options later on. And the eventual negotiation scene here is fantastic, being the first display of how your choices can affect the outcome, where there are a number of ways that this conversation can play out. Where obviously the optimal way to handle this is by approaching him slowly and gaining his trust using calm dialogue options. Also along the way, you can save a cop that will later show up in the Public Enemy chapter, which is a cool connection there. But getting to the deviant here makes him let go of the hostage, only for the police to shoot him down anyway. Though there is other ways to save her, through you deciding to shoot him yourself, or you can even sacrifice yourself by throwing Conor over the edge along with him, to which most of the times you end up saving the girl as well. Though you can technically also end up failing in everything here and end up killing her, which again really just shows you the variety of situations in this game. Where while none of these end up having a true effect on the game moving forward, just the sheer number of outcomes for this chapter is something that is impressive right off the bat. Though again, there are some outcomes here that do lead to Conor dying, which this is probably the biggest example of your choices not mattering as much as you expect them to, where if he does die here or in any of the earlier chapters in the game, he's not dead permanently, he instead just gets replaced by a new Conor model, essentially resetting his software instability every time and can harm his relationships with the characters he meets along the way. So again, it technically still makes your choices matter, though it does completely nullify this tension over is Conor going to die, as it doesn't really matter that much, which I do find slightly underwhelming, though also it does make sense for this to be a mechanic in this game where, and one, obviously the game wants you to continue playing these Conor sections, but also it does just make narrative sense that they would continue to replace Conor, especially with him being the representation of a non-deviant android in the story. Again, it does make sense why they would take this route, even though realistically I think it was just done because they wanted you to continue playing Conor sections. Now, next chapter, the opening is largely just a glorified cutscene introducing us to Cara, the next of our protagonists, as she is booted up in an Android store after being repaired, seeing her getting picked up by her owner, Todd, who instantly comes off as this creepy guy that you later find out was the one that damaged her to begin with. But this leads to the opening credits, which contain shots of this futuristic Detroit as they drive home, and really the setting of Detroit never felt like that important of a location here. While I do think the world building as a whole is much better in this game than previous Quantic Dream games, as exemplified by this and the following few chapters, which largely revolve around this world building. Again, setting up how androids are treated in this society, I still don't feel like any of the greatness of this world building has anything to do with the city of choice here, which is really strange considering Detroit is literally in the name of this game. By the way, we follow this up with the Shades of Color chapter, with us getting introduced to the final protagonist here in Marcus, who, again, in terms of the core plot of the game, does feel like the main character, which I do think is a shame considering I actually feel like he's the most bland of the protagonists here. And I don't think it's necessarily the actor's fault, but I just feel like the material given to the other two characters make them much more dynamic characters, while Marcus ends up coming off way more surface level to me, with him being relegated to more generic tropes. Not mixing that in with his more subdued performance, he easily is the character that stands out the least out of these three. But this chapter is an impressive piece of world building, again having us play as Marcus, who at this point is a common android running errands for his owner, and we have Marcus walking through a park and then later a city street on the way to a paint store, where along the way you can interact with the nearby people, once again showcasing how discriminated androids are in this society, being used as objects and tools, as we even see at the store where the shopkeeper is also another fellow android. And the chapter does conclude with what is probably the most heavy-handed display up to this point, with the buses being segregated as well, which again feels like David Cage back to his old ways of being way too blatant with his themes. Again, this being a clear reference to segregation in America, and Marcus's role in the story clearly mirrors that of the civil rights movement, which again adds to the melodramatic nature of this game. But then we get to A New Home chapter with us playing as Cara for the first time, where we see her essentially act as Todd's maid, being told to cook and clean, while also being in charge of taking care of his daughter Alice. And we do spend this chapter following his orders, doing monotonous tasks around the house, and obviously this chapter does a really good job at making you sympathize for Cara, showing her under the rule of this abusive deadbeat dad, but also this ends up showing the starting point of the Cara-Alice relationship, which really ends up being a bulk of Cara's content in this game that further humanizes her character, being in line with the trope of this parent-child relationship that is an extremely effective trope within the gaming medium, with it feeling like it's also the player's job to protect Alice across this game. Though your initial conversation with Alice can go a number of ways, including her divulging to Cara about the reality of her injuries, though really none of this plays a major impact on the narrative moving forward. Though a nice touch here is that this chapter also unknowingly acts as a recon session for the following scene, with things like seeing Todd's gun or noticing an open window can offer more choices during a later escape sequence. But then we return to Marcus in the Painter chapter, which shows Marcus returning home, where we end up meeting his owner, Carl Manfred, an ailing artist who comes off as the antithesis to Todd, where while realistically Marcus is still being used by Carl as a servant, we do see Carl being this loving and caring individual to Marcus, while also challenging Marcus to think critically, with us getting this scene of him encouraging Marcus to paint, and the relationship between these two is a nice change of pace in this game, with most human characters coming off as really unlikable, and at best later having a redemption arc, but Carl is one of the few characters that comes off as likable off the bat. Though by the end of this chapter, the prejudice against androids becomes prominent once again through the appearance of Leo, Carl's drug addict son, who shows resentment at Marcus for claiming that Carl cares more about him than his own son, which obviously sets up the inciting incident of Marcus's story. But then we finally return to Conor in the Partners chapter, which has Conor go into a bar to find his new partner, and that being Lieutenant Hank Anderson, who depending on your choices ends up being another of the more likable human characters in the game, though a lot of that has to do with how you handle Conor's relationship with him, as he does initially come off as this dismissive anti-android presence, though if you play your cards right, the bond between Conor and Hank can lead to a nice redemption arc for him, but this does eventually lead us to the crime scene where a deviant had just murdered their owner, and this leads to our next investigation section, which is a pretty expansive one, and one that can greatly affect not only the outcome of this chapter, but also the appearance of another. But during this investigation, we do get introduced to the concept of RA9, a word constantly mentioned by deviant androids across this game, and feels like an interesting setup to this mystery of what RA9 is, though that strangely never gets answered. But the investigation ends up being one that is easily failable, where if you take too much time, Hank will want to leave, which interestingly, based on how you treated Hank at the bar earlier, will affect whether or not he gives you more time to investigate. Though either way, the mission does end up having a time limit, but succeeding here does allow you to find the deviant in the attic, which in turn will unlock the Interrogation chapter, which through doing so can make the finding of Jericho later on a lot easier. So this chapter does have some pretty major ramifications for future chapters. But following this, we do return to Cara's storyline for the Stormy Night chapter, which ends up being the inciting incident for her story, while also being the first action sequence in this game, where after a disturbing dinner scene with Todd clearly being under the influence and him hitting Alice for looking at him funny, where the rant that he ends up going on here really actually doesn't really make that much sense considering the later Alice reveal, but again, that's David Cage for you. But again, is this abuse of Alice that causes Cara to become a deviant, again playing into the themes of her showing her motherly instincts for Alice, though interestingly here, this in itself is failable, where if you fail this QuickTime event to become a deviant, then Todd will end up killing Alice, and that will be it for Cara. Obviously a terrible outcome, but really interesting that the game allows you to do what Heavy Rain was unwilling to do in terms of having your choices matter very early on, where in Heavy Rain, while playable characters can die, they don't die until very late into the game, whereas here at Cara, her entire storyline can be locked away right from the beginning of the game, which in turn does also technically show you how relevant Cara's storyline is to the main plot, but I do also have respect for the fact that they left this in as an option. But really the rest of the chapter is this big action sequence of rescuing Alice from Todd, which can obviously play out in a number of ways. You could technically get to Alice before Todd finds her, and in turn escape without even having to fight Todd. Otherwise, there is this chase sequence, which can also lead to Todd killing Cara, also ending Cara's storyline. But again, if you end up exploring the house in the previous chapter, you do open up opportunities to escape through the window or kill Todd using his own gun. Though either way, succeeding in this sequence leads to Cara and Alice escaping on a bus, now with Cara being a fugitive, either for killing Todd or just being a deviant. But we do follow that up with the inciting incident from Marcus's story in the Broken chapter. Though unlike the previous chapter, this one is not failable, again showing you how important Marcus's story is to the core narrative. But this chapter has Leo confronting Carl, leading to Carl getting hurt, which is what causes Marcus to become a deviant, but afterwards also giving Marcus the choice on whether or not to step in after Carl begs him not to, which does lead to some bizarre ramifications, with obeying Carl for some reason leads to Carl dying, in which Marcus gets blamed for his death, though attacking Leo leads to Carl surviving for some reason, while instead Marcus gets mistaken as the aggressor for the situation. And again, I do find the fact that this arbitrary choice is what decides whether or not Carl survives to be extremely contrived, where obviously the reason he dies in the other outcome is because they need an excuse for the plot to exist in that scenario, where otherwise it doesn't make sense. Which obviously you don't know in your first playthrough what the other option is, but after knowing all the different scenarios, this does feel pretty dumb. But either way, the chapter does end with Marcus being shot down, again being wrongly accused of something, again being this big melodramatic backstory for Marcus that again heavy-handedly makes him a sympathetic character here. But this is where we do return to Conor through the Interrogation chapter, which again will be skipped if you failed the investigation in the Partners chapter. Though here we obviously have the interrogation of the found deviant, where Conor can take a number of approaches to this conversation. I mean, you can convince or pressure him to talk, you can give up, which is funny, or you can probe his memories. But through this, you will see that a deviant's owner was abusive to him, once again showing the deviants in a positive light, which I will say that in itself, that is a minor issue I do have with this game, where I get what David Cage is doing here by making every deviant have a tragic backstory to further portray the deviants in a sympathetic light while also demonizing the humans in order to further the themes. But the fact that we don't ever see a single truly villainous deviant does still come off as kind of ridiculous and adds to this heavy-handed nature of this game's message. So this chapter can end in a number of ways, which again varies based on how you approach the investigation, though really none of it has major long-term ramifications. Though convincing him here does lead to him helping you in your search for Jericho later in the game, while otherwise he ends up shooting himself and can also end up killing Conor as well, though again obviously he comes back the following chapter anyway. But then we return to Cara for the Fugitive chapter, which is one that is highly variant, with it comprising of Cara and Alice needing to find a place to stay for the night, which can lead to numerous outcomes and paths to this mission, which is something I greatly respect from this game, again showing how it expands upon this Heavy Rain formula. But the mission does start with Cara and Alice being stranded in the middle of the city after being kicked off the bus, and here we randomly interact with an android that gives us the address that eventually leads us to Zlatko, who she goes to the following day. Though considering what we later learn about Zlatko, it's never explained why this android's just randomly giving you this address, considering he kills whoever goes there. But again, the more immediate issue is finding shelter for the night. And again, there are a wide range of ways to approach this section, with there being 3 possible places to end up staying, but each having their own requirements to allow you to end up staying there. The optimal location is obviously to stay in a motel. However, with androids not being allowed to stay there and also requiring money, you do need to go to the laundromat and convenience store nearby and to get those needed supplies. But taking this route does harm your relationship status with Alice, with her not wanting you to steal, which you're obviously required to do to unlock this route. Obviously making this a morally ambiguous situation, especially with the convenience store scene being particularly messed up, where you can use Alice as a distraction as you go to steal money from the register, or even just outright pull out a gun and rob the clerk at gunpoint, again with Alice accompanying you, so that's pretty messed up. But the most most basic option here is staying in an abandoned car, which is the only non-failable one here, essentially making it the worst of the bunch. But the most interesting of these outcomes to me is the squat branch, which ends up having additional content, with you finding another android there in Ralph, who instantly comes off as unhinged, but in reality he's harmless just like most other deviants. And you can convince him to let you spend a night in the abandoned house, which again is failable, and again it is cool that this is a character that depending on your choices you could just straight up never meet. But no matter what path you take, they all end up with the same interactions with Alice at the end of the night, with you promising her that you'll be together forever, and really with this entire chapter being you finding a safe place to stay for the night, not really for you, but for Alice, ends up being a satisfying way to bond these characters. But then we return to Marcus in the From the Dead chapter, which I've always hated, where it does entirely comprise of Marcus piecing himself back together after awakening in a junkyard, which is this lengthy section of you finding the correct pieces needed to repair himself. And while it is really immersive, where when his senses are hampered, the player themselves also face those ramifications, which again is cool, but I still find this just be an annoying gameplay section, though through this, one of the androids in the junkyard ends up informing him about Jericho, the supposed utopia for androids, which feels like another contrivance here of Marcus just learning about this out of the blue here, right as it becomes relevant. Again, I feel like it would have been better had Jericho been set up a bit earlier on in his story, but also I hate how this chapter concludes, where in David Cage fashion, we get the most blatant thematic messaging of Marcus clearly being portrayed as this Christ figure after coming back from the dead, which again just feels so dumb. But then we return to Conor for the Waiting for Hank chapter, where again, if you fail the investigation of the partners chapter, this will be the next time you see the character. Now, the chapter does start with our first visit to the Zen Garden, where we do interact with Conor's handler, I guess, in Amanda, where periodically in the story moving forward, we do get similar sections to this, where Conor talks through his mission with her, which I'll be honest, I never fully understood exactly what this is. Now, I get that this isn't the real world, but I never understood if Amanda is there just entirely in his own head through his programming, or if Amanda is actually the embodiment of cyberlife speaking to him. But either way, we do eventually get to the titular Waiting for Hank after finding his desk, where we can investigate it to learn more about him, which will help you with later dialogue options. Though also here we get to meet Hank's co-workers, most of which come off as dicks here, with Gavin Reed in particular coming off as a foil for Conor moving forward. Though the way the chapter ends does change based on whether or not Cara is alive, as it obviously sets up the following Conor chapter, where if she is alive, then Hank gets a lead, leading to the On the Run chapter, while otherwise Hank will want to get lunch, leading up to the events of the nest. But again, if Cara is alive, we do get the On the Run chapter here, the first time we see two protagonists in the same scene, with both Conor and Cara playable in this one chapter, something that is rarely done in Heavy Rain, though initially this chapter does focus on Cara. But the starting point of this location, again, obviously changes based off the conclusion of the Fugitive chapter, where no matter what here, Cara will end up getting a haircut and get the very important choice of picking what hair color she has. But again, this squat path does have additional content here with interactions with Ralph, which leads to him catching a rat and wanting a family dinner, which is a disturbing scene. Though also this leads to getting an additional Conor section, where he ends up finding the house, and he gets an investigation section here, where if he fails, the chapter actually ends there with Cara and Alice getting away, though succeeding here does lead to this merging with the other two paths, with both the motel and the abandoned car routes playing out pretty similarly, with Cara and Alice getting longer heads up to Conor and Hank's arrival, and we do get this weird stealth section of them sneaking their way to the train station, where if you do, the chapter concludes with their escape, though in any of these scenarios, if Conor ends up finding Cara and Alice, it leads to you playing as Conor as you chase them down, which I've always found to be a particularly weird scene, as I remember when I first playing it, I just really didn't want to catch Cara and Alice. And while I don't want to lessen Conor's credibility either, I remember initially wanting to actively fail this section as Conor. Though this ends up being another area where Cara and Alice and even Conor can die during the crossing of the highway, though Conor will be revived later on, while again this would just be the end of Cara's story once again. Though interestingly here we do get to see the first glimpse of development for Hank, with him trying to get Conor to stop his chase with the worry of Conor getting killed, and we do get the choice here on whether or not to continue going, also being this nice development for Conor, with this being an opportunity for him to show his humane side. Though again, most of the outcomes here do still lead to Cara and Alice escaping either way. Though following this, we do get the return to Marcus with the Jericho chapter, which is another Marcus chapter I find largely annoying, where it comprises of him having to find graffiti markers that lead him on a trail to the location of Jericho, where mixing the tedium of finding these markers and also these like pseudo puzzle sections of finding the optimal path from the parkour through, this just leads to this section really dragging on with no real narrative significance outside of just finding Jericho, which could have been done in a couple minutes. So he ends up finding it on a deserted boat where the chapter ends before even being able to interact with anyone from Jericho. But that ends up bringing us back to Conor in the Nest chapter, which starts with Hank's lunch break, where the interactions between Conor and Hank here vary based on the status of their relationship at this point, with the reception being pretty frosty had Conor gotten himself killed and on the run, but eventually we do have the duo investigating into another deviant, giving us our next investigation section of this really creepy, decrepit apartment filled with birds and clearly being occupied by an android. But again, it is another investigation that you can fail and never find a deviant, though if you do, it leads to this lengthy chase sequence where again, Conor can die, though interestingly, we do get a pretty big choice along the way for the Conor-Hank relationship, where the deviant ends up pushing Hank over the ledge and you are given the choice of saving him and in turn letting the deviant go or continuing on to go after him. Now, catching the deviant again leads to benefits in the search for Jericho later on, though for the story and the arcs of Conor and Hank, I do think it makes a lot more sense to save Hank here, once again being an opportunity for Conor to show his humanity and it getting in the way of his investigation. But following this, we do return to Marcus for the Time to Decide chapter, which is a pretty short one, but it does have Marcus's first interactions with the people of Jericho, finding them in a pretty frail state with numerous dying androids and overall just a grim tone amongst its inhabitants. Though here we do meet the characters that end up working alongside Marcus moving forward, most of them just being fine. I'm not really being the most notable characters in the world, just really just bland, but again, that's really just Marcus's entire storyline. Though North ends up being the most important of the bunch, being a potential love interest for Marcus and potential replacement for him if Marcus dies before the end. Though in most instances, with Marcus alive, the characters of North and Josh mostly just feel like these two characters there to set up two different point of views, where whenever given a choice, you are usually led with one agreeing with it while the other doesn't. But also here you meet Simon, who is the group's current leader, who is just kind of lame. He's there. But the chapter ends with Marcus taking the initiative to create a plan to steal some parts from a CyberLife facility to repair the damaged androids at Jericho, starting his rise to leadership in this group. But then we get to one of the biggest chapters in the game, but strangely one that has such a minor effect on the narrative as a whole, which is the Zlatko chapter, which is a mostly episodic chapter here, but despite that, it ends up being one of the most memorable ones in my eyes, putting us back in control of Cara as she arrives at the location given to her at the beginning of the Fugitive chapter, which ends up being the home of Zlatko, who we assume will offer refuge to them, though in reality he's obviously this really creepy guy as you would expect from a David Cage game, and in many ways this chapter does remind me of the Doc chapter from Heavy Rain, where you go to the home of a seemingly mild-mannered man that turns out to be extremely deranged and puts the female protagonist in a life or death situation. Again, it plays with the same formula here, but I do think the inclusion of Alice and Cara's need to protect her does greatly add stakes to this situation, where we do find out that Zlatko is actually a mad scientist, luring deviants in and using them for experiments, and after this reveal we have Zlatko attempting to reset Cara, to which I actually do think it's best for the narrative that you fail in escaping here, where succeeding just leads to the rest of the chapter being this set piece of sneaking through the house to find Alice and escaping, but failing adds more weight to the situation here, where you still play as Cara now under Zlatko's control and you have to explore the house to find ways to remind you of Alice. Once again showing the humanity within Cara, where despite her memory being erased, showing that she isn't just this programming that can be overwritten, though again taking too much time here will lead to Cara remaining reset and again effectively ending Cara's storyline, though otherwise you will find Alice and still get this massive set piece of escaping from Zlatko, where again you can be killed by him. There are a number of ways to better your odds in the fight, where you can free the experiments downstairs to the point where they will help you take Zlatko down. So either way, Luther, Zlatko's main servant, will also end up turning against him, which I guess is explained by him being inspired by the relationship of Cara and Alice, which is kind of dumb, but this feels like a Frankenstein's monster sort of moment, in that he can be the one that kills Latko here, and Luther ends up being a pretty likable figure throughout this game, feeling like a co-parent for Alice. In the later Cara chapters, though, he is technically a character that can die at numerous opportunities, so technically a lot of that is based on how you play the game. Though I will say that something interesting here on the replay is that you can tell that there are some attempts to foreshadow the future Alice twists. Though even then there are some question marks over why is Alice locked away instead of being reset, like Cara was, that don't fully make it work. But as a whole, while the chapter doesn't add much to the plot outside of adding Luther to the story, it does end up providing one of the more tense set pieces in the game, and through that becomes one of the more notable chapters in the game. But then we return to Conor for the Russian Roulette chapter, which has Conor going to Hank's house in order to find him once again, but there we find Hank passed out on the floor having played a game of Russian Roulette, where during this chapter we can learn about Hank's son's death at the hands of an android, obviously explaining Hank's treatment of Conor, but also perfectly sets up his redemption arc. Though really this chapter just ends up being another one of us waiting for Hank for him to get prepared, while also learning more about him through exploring through his personal items. But then we get to our first action-based mission with Marcus in the Spare Parts chapter, which most of his chapters from this point forward are very action-heavy and do involve Jericho breaking into something to try to propel Jericho's agenda. Though this one ends up being a bit more of a baseline heist mission of trying to hunt down parts for the other androids, and along the way we do get more parkour-based puzzles, though this ends up being the first time that we see Marcus free other androids, as he can somehow touch them to make them deviants, which, again, the Jesus parallels here are extremely humorous, and again, never really explained why Marcus is so special here. I mean, I guess you can say it's because of Carl, who had raised him differently than most other androids, but even that is never explained here. Though really a lot of the choices here, and again from this point forward, do end up affecting the public perception of Jericho, where you can take either a peaceful or a violent approach, which can lead to you recruiting one of the security guards here, and can open up an additional stealth section that will allow you to steal a truck full of parts, being the optimal outcome for this chapter, though one that really doesn't have a major effect on the story here, as no matter what, Marcus can't die in this mission, though obviously you can fail to get any parts, which would just make this entire chapter pointless. And really, as a whole, like outside of introducing Marcus's role as the new leader and also his ability to convert androids into deviants, this chapter doesn't really add much to the plot. But then we return to Conor in Eden Club chapter, and by this point I do feel like a lot of these Conor investigation chapters are starting to get a bit repetitive, with the same structure once again of finding out a deviant killed their victim in self-defense, and we do get a failable investigation leading up to finding that deviant, though this one does feel a bit more unique with it occurring within a strip club, though I always found the investigation section itself to be pretty annoying, with you having to probe nearby androids to follow the path to the deviant, and also the time limit here feels relatively strict to previous chapters, though eventually you do get into a fight with the two escaped deviants, and you can just straight up lose and they will escape anyway, but the better outcome here narratively is for you to win, but at that point you are given the choice of sparing them or killing them, after finding out that they are in love, which ends up being this massive moment for Hank, with this seeming to be the moment where he realizes the humanity within these androids, but also within Conor, where again, I mean, another situation of him having his humanity overtake his need of solving the case, which was supposed to be his entire purpose. But following this, we do return to Cara for the Pirates Cove chapter, one that I find largely unnecessary, though it does further bond the characters of Cara, Alice, and Luther, where their car breaks down and they have to find refuge within a theme park, so they end up staying in a tavern, where they do have interactions with the Jerrys, who again are these deviants that initially seem to be antagonists, only for them to be harmless. But this chapter ends with a pretty nice moment of Alice riding a carousel, being this now generic moment of levity during what is otherwise an extremely dark, depressing game. So again, a nice moment there, but we then return to Conor for the Bridge chapter, another relatively short one, but this one containing a pretty great conversation between Conor and Hank. That's Hank coming to grips with his shifting opinions on androids, where he pulls a gun on Conor, and in turn, we get a number of ways to respond to this, including showing fear, showing the shift in Conor with him starting to recognize his humanity, feeling like a pretty impactful moment for both of these characters. But depending on your relationship with Hank, this sequence can easily go wrong, with Hank potentially killing Conor if he sees no humanity within him. But then we return to Marcus for the next of his heist-style missions, in this being the Stratford Tower, where now Jericho plan on breaking into a news station in order to broadcast their message to the masses. And this leads to a lengthy section of Marcus working his way up the building, having to sneak past security, and also pretending to be a maintenance worker to get to the server room, only for them to climb up the outside of the building to get to the top floor, which this game really props up as this big epic moment, but I find a lot of this just really mundane, as on a replay it makes you realize just none of this is failable anyway. Though this section can still affect the outcome of the chapter, where if you get caught along the way or decide to take a more aggressive approach, it will lead to the escape sequence later being tougher and also lessening the perception of Jericho from the public. But no matter what, you reach the station and end up delivering a message to the public, which you can choose to speak peacefully or determinedly, which again will affect Jericho's perception. And this scene for some reason just makes me kind of laugh, where the delivery of the speech is just really awkward, which makes sense considering it's an android trying to give this emotional speech, but the stiltedness of Marcus's performance here still makes it pretty funny to me. Though also I do find it weird how there is this dichotomy between choices through this, where there's nothing stopping you from taking a violent approach on your way up to the station and killing guards along the way, only for you to then give a message about peace, which comes off as ridiculous. But afterwards, we do get the escape sequence where Simon can be killed along the way, though even if he doesn't die, he can also just be left behind, but I mean, really, who cares, because it's Simon. Though this does end up affecting the following chapter, where we deal with the ramifications of the situation playing as Conor in the Public Enemy chapter, which ends up being one of the more variant chapters in the game, where there are a wide range of ways that this investigation section can play out, and also has a lot of ramifications from previous chapters, to where again, this is the point where I gave up on my quest to 100% every flowchart just due to the scale of this mission. But again, most of the choices that Marcus makes in the previous chapter do lead to minor changes in this investigation, though weirdly this ends up being an investigation that you yourself can put an end to really early on, and never even see the branching storylines here. But if you do stay, there are two main paths that you can continue through this chapter, though I find it strange that you can't do both, as they aren't mutually exclusive, but the first outcome can only be accessed if Simon was left behind, where you can find him on the roof, and this starts a shootout with him, where he can actually be killed here, whether by his SWAT team or by Conor himself, though here Simon can kill Conor as well, though finding Simon locks out the other path, while taking the other path actually allows Simon to survive through this and appear in later Marcus chapters. Now the other outcome has you investigating these androids that work at the station, with one of them clearly being a deviant and you having to interrogate them to find out which one it is. But no matter what, the deviant ends up attacking you, leading to a massive action sequence where Conor can die, again in a number of ways, from either taking too long to repair himself or sacrificing himself to protect Hank, which is probably the only time that Conor dying seems like a decent option. Though realistically, it is completely avoidable, as you could just choose to draw your gun, to which he kills the deviant without any ramifications, so it just feels kind of dumb. But again, if Conor survives this, nothing is stopping him from also finding Simon. So again, it's still strange to me that the chapter just abruptly ends there. But following this, we do return to Cara for what ends up being the final solo Cara chapter in the game. Again, showing that her story isn't the main focus here, but this has Cara and co finding Rose, a woman willing to help them cross the border into Canada, which ends up being the main goal for Cara following this chapter, with Canada conveniently being a country with no anti-android laws, making it a safe haven for them. But the main gameplay of this section ends up occurring when a cop arrives to search for deviants, leading to us having to hide all the evidence of deviants, which plays out similarly to the Manfred chapter in Heavy Rain, though we do get this tense scene as the cop investigates the house, where again failing this does lead to the death of Luther, who ends up sacrificing himself to kill the policeman, though obviously the more optimal outcome here is for him to survive and still be with Cara and Alice moving forward, as the losing of Luther here does actually add some ridiculous to the story that we will talk about. But then we return to Marcus for the Capitol Park chapter, which is another Marcus chapter. It kind of drags, though. This one is also easily failable, to where it can just lead to Marcus essentially getting nothing done here. Where the point of this chapter is to rescue more androids from the Cyberline store, and we work alongside North to break into it by ramming a truck into it. Though first we have to avoid detection by securing the area, and deactivating the alarm, though again failing at that will cause the mission to end prematurely. So even in that situation, I don't get why Marcus just doesn't convert the androids anyway, as it doesn't seem to waste that much time in the situation where he succeeds. But either way, the chapter ends with Marcus making a statement either through throwing a riot or leading a peaceful protest, which is weird that he's doing this considering it's in the middle of the night. And no matter what, you end up interacting with some police anyway, to which you are given the choice of killing them or sparing them, though again, none of that really seems to matter outside of public perception, which again really just makes this entire chapter feel like a waste of time, as it really doesn't progress the plot in any significant way. But then we jump back to Conor in the Meet Kamski chapter, which has Conor and Hank meeting with Kamski, the creator of the androids, who ends up being an eccentric figure here, who ends up divvying out very little information in your conversation with him, to where he eventually offers to actually answer a question if Conor passes the test of killing Chloe, who makes her first in-game appearance here, though technically it is obviously a different model. But obviously the optimal move here is to not shoot Chloe, which in turn gains you the respect of Hank. And while it doesn't give you any answers, the dumb thing about all this is that even if you do shoot her, Kamski doesn't even answer most of the questions that you can ask him, with the only one that he will help you with is the finding of Jericho, which doesn't really add much substance here, as you just do that in the following chapter anyway. So again, I just feel like all of this felt like a lot of wasted time, though again, how the decision affects your relationship with Hank is the main ramification of this. But then we get the final solo Marcus chapter in the game, and that being the Freedom March, and this is just ridiculous. Where I have mentioned the blatant thematic messaging throughout this game, but this really takes the cake here, feeling like they're directly copying the March on Washington. But before that, we do get a short scene between Marcus and North, where this starts their potential romantic relationship, though you could also just be a dick and not want to talk to her, to which she would just leave, which is funny. Also, if Simon survives Public Enemy, he rejoins the group here because why not, I guess. But then we get to the march, where Marcus frees androids at the mall to start the protest, and again, this entire scene comes off as ridiculous to me, coming off as such an over-the-top moment, and so on the nose, that it's just funny how little subtlety David Cage has in his writing here, and as expected, eventually the police arrive and fire unprovoked, giving you the choice of running away or fighting back, where if you fight, it ends up being the first time that Marcus can actually die in the main story, again being in line with the likes of how Heavy Rain portrayed character deaths, where this is towards the end of the game, so it's not like you're going to miss out on that much of the game. And if he does die, again, his role is replaced by North as the leader of the rebellion, though obviously those sections are not playable. Though even then, he can only die here if both Simon and John, the guard that you recruit during the spare parts chapter, are both dead, as otherwise they'll sacrifice themselves for Marcus, which, okay, I guess. I mean, they are pretty relevant characters, though. Again, this entire sequence just comes off as really over the top here, and how surface level this entire situation is displayed here with no sense of subtlety on how the themes are being conveyed. But then we get to the last of the solo Conor chapters in the game, in Last Chance Conor, in a position where Conor can be the only protagonist still alive by this point, and with this mission being failable too, this ends up being the last playable chapter in the worst possible outcome playthrough. But the chapter plays out similarly to Norman Jaden's last chapter in Heavy Rain, with Conor and Hank being taken off the case, and now having to use all the evidence they've collected so far in order to find Jericho's location. Now again, if he got it from Kamski, the chapter just ends there almost immediately, but otherwise we have to find a way to the evidence room to investigate, but this leads to us needing a distraction to get there undetected. Now if your relationship with Hank is good enough, he'll end up helping you by causing a ruckus by punching Agent Perkins, who I have failed to mention up to this point, as he really doesn't do anything until the very end of the game here, where he is this anti-android FBI agent that from this point forward essentially acts as the main antagonist of the game, with him leading the authorities against the androids. But throughout his entire run here, does come off as a pretty big dick, and really without Hank there, the situation plays out similarly, just that you have to free a prisoner, and that prisoner punch Perkins instead, which obviously doesn't hold as much weight. Though throughout this entire mission, you can run out of time here, here, where if you do so, then Conor will end up being decommissioned and have him never finding Jericho, which in turn can end Conor's role in the story. But the evidence that you have to work with here is largely determined on the outcomes of the previous investigations, and in turn has a number of cool references to those chapters, including the ability to revive each of those deviants Conor has taken down. And I really like the puzzle design here in that you essentially have to trick these deviants into giving up their information by using Conor's android abilities to manipulate them. And again, this is actually a cool sequence here, though even with finding Jericho's location, that's not the end of the chapter just yet, as this is where we do get the final interaction with Gavin Reed, who can kill Conor in this fight here, though even if he does, it doesn't really matter as you already know Jericho's location anyway, meaning that when he gets revived, he just goes there anyway. So again, doesn't really play a major factor in the story here, though obviously is a way more satisfying outcome to be able to knock him out here. But with that, that takes us to the end game, the final 3 chapters in the game, each of which being shared chapters, though again there is a way that none of the characters survive at this point if Marcus and Cara die and Conor doesn't find Jericho, which leads to a special ending of the android threat being eradicated and Cyberline having solved the deviant problem, which is obviously a terrible outcome, though really these chapters are very difficult to run through, largely due to the sheer ridiculousness of how many varied outcomes that can happen here, and also the constant changing of characters. But again, I'll try my best here. But with that, we'll start off the chapter Crossroads, which is clearly a reference to this being the first chapter where all the characters can come together, all convening at Jericho, though again, you can enter this chapter with only Conor alive, so again, that's not much of a crossroads. But the beginning of the chapter does focus more so on Cara, who is driven to Jericho by Rose, because I guess she has a connection to Marcus somehow. But this leads to Cara and Marcus meeting, or it will be North if Marcus is dead by this point, though here he agrees to give her fake passports, which really just feels like a very abrupt scene. And considering like this and just a minor conversation in the following chapter are really the only times that we see Marcus and Cara interact, and also Cara barely interacts with Conor either, it does make it a bit underwhelming that these characters don't come together a bit more, or at least in Heavy Rain, despite my criticisms of how the characters of Norman Jayden and Madison Paige are mostly irrelevant to the story, at least they do team up with Ethan by the end of it, where Cara really doesn't even do that here. And again, a lot of that's just because Cara's role in the main plot is just not that significant, which is ironic considering she was actually the first character created for this game, with her being part of the original tech demo that inspired this game. But again, I still do think Cara's storyline does an effective job at building up this game's themes. But following this is where we get the big twist, where when trying to find Alice on the way out, Cara ends up finding an android that looks just like Alice, revealing to us that Alice was actually an android all along. And strangely, if Luther is dead here, she gets told this by Lucy, Jericho's nurse, who she doesn't know, so that's really weird. But overall, I kinda hate this twist. While it is a cool reveal initially, it is one that really recontextualizes Cara's story in an underwhelming way. Now again, there are some plot holes to this, but nothing too major, especially in comparison to the Scott Shelby reveal in Heavy Rain, to where it doesn't really bother me from a plot perspective. It's more so from a thematic perspective, where Cara and Alice's relationship up to this point was one that did a very effective job at showing how humans and androids can coexist and how they needed each other. But to find out that Alice is an android does nullify that theme in favor of again just reiterating how these androids can display humanity, which again is technically the broader theme of the entire story, but it's one that we've already seen so many times in this story. And with me thinking up to this point that Cara's storyline was doing something new with that theme instead of just reiterating the same thing, it does leave it very underwhelming when we do get this reveal, even though again I don't really hate it from a pure plot perspective. Though something I didn't even know was possible until my research for this video is the fact that you can actually reject Alice after this reveal, to which Cara will end up leaving Jericho alone, which blew my mind that this is a possible outcome. Though if Conor doesn't find Jericho, Cara's part of the chapter ends here, with her just leaving Jericho. Though if he does find it, it does lead to the FBI following suit, leading to a pretty big action sequence of her escaping, and if Luther is still alive, he once again has numerous opportunities to die here, sacrificing himself for Cara and Alice to escape. Though if you end up failing, they end up getting captured, leaving open the worst possible outcome for them in my eyes, and putting you on track with the more depressing of the two routes for Cara's storyline in the final chapter, where otherwise again they are on the path to escaping through the Canadian border, which makes the two possible paths for Cara's story radically different. which really highlights the expansiveness of this game to where there's a massive chunk of the game that can just simply never be experienced if you fail this section right here. Now for Conor's role in this chapter, it does have him finding Jericho and confronting Marcus/North, where Conor is finally given the decision of becoming a deviant, where this choice ends up branching his storyline out as well, where remaining a machine leads to an action sequence between Conor and Marcus/North, where in both situations Conor ends up dying, though there is a chance of him killing Marcus, though either way at this point Conor does remain an antagonistic figure for the rest of the game, feeling like this Terminator-esque character, which I don't mind as a foil to Marcus and essentially being the antithesis to him, but also I do feel like it's largely underwhelming considering how much development there could have been with Conor before this. While becoming a deviant here has Conor warning Marcus of the upcoming attack, leading to a ridiculous amount of scenarios, leading to Conor having a role in the massive action sequence at Jericho, though obviously gives him the opportunity of taking over Marcus's role if Marcus ends up dying along the way. And now for Marcus's role, which is that he's there for action sequences. Though there is a scenario that I didn't even know was possible, and that Marcus can be just straight up kicked out of Jericho if Jericho's too unpopular, which is funny to me. But otherwise, again, lengthy action sequences, where along the way you can see the death of Josh, who can sacrifice himself for Marcus, which is sad, I guess, but it's Josh who really cares. But also Marcus can sacrifice himself along the way. But really Marcus's role in this chapter is the least interesting of the bunch, with again Cara and Conor both having big character moments across this chapter, while Marcus is simply just there. But this brings us to the penultimate chapter, Night of the Soul, which only focuses on Marcus and Conor. Again, no Cara, because that's David Cage for you. But this chapter ends up being the calm before the storm, and also one that can play out in a wide range of ways, where it will primarily focus on Marcus, if he is still alive, again being this development for him that again was lacking in that previous chapter. Though again, even this initial scene though is different based around if Carl is still alive or not, where if he is, we go to visit him back at home, which feels like a nice full circle moment, bringing us back to where Marcus's story started and giving us this great moment of Marcus reconciling with Carl and asking him for advice, leading to Carl recognizing Marcus as his son, which is a touching moment. Though if Carl is dead, we do have Marcus visiting his grave and still talking about his situation, but it's clearly not as satisfying of a scene. But following this, we do have Marcus giving a speech to the remnants of Jericho, where we get to decide on our course of action. We choose between a peaceful protest or a violent attack. Though along the way, we get these final one-on-one conversations with the other deviants, as you would expect before the final conflict of any game. Though with your final conversation with a deviant Conor, you are given the choice of killing him or sparing him, which I just found this to be a really strange decision to be added to the game immediately after Conor had just attempted to redeem himself. Though strangely, if Marcus is dead while Conor still becomes a deviant, we play this section as Conor instead, where he has these final conversations with these people he doesn't know, obviously not having the same impact. Though in this scenario, and really any scenario where Marcus is dead, North ends up becoming the leader of the revolt, choosing the more violent option there. But the other way this mission can play out is that if Marcus is dead and Conor doesn't become a deviant, we will instead play as Conor as he visits Hank for a final time, only to watch Hank commit suicide. Again, a terrible outcome for his character, really setting up the worst possible outcome there. But this is what brings us to the final chapter in the game, Battle for Detroit. And again, just looking at this mission's flowchart is insane. Like, this is a mission that has an absurd amount of outcomes and paths, but let's just start by talking about Cara's, especially because, again, she is the most disconnected from the core plot, where had she avoided capture, we do see her as she attempts to escape Detroit in what is a pretty lengthy stealth sequence, where if she gets captured at any point, the story plays out as if she had been captured in the previous chapter, sending us to the other path. But eventually we do get a series of pretty tense scenes with us having to cross a security checkpoint, and later at the bus terminal we do run into issues again with us not having tickets to get on the bus, leading to a moral dilemma of stealing tickets from a family that dropped their tickets, which doing so is the only way that you can get to the Canadian border, as otherwise you'll be stuck at the station and forced to undergo a security check, which will lead to Cara getting killed unless she finds a way out. The other outcome ends up being Cara being saved by Rose and her son Adam, who attempt to smuggle Cara across the border through crossing a river, which can be the ending for Cara and Alice. though as expected there are complications along the way with the Coast Guard appearing, and if Luther is alive by that point he is guaranteed to die in this scenario, while both Cara and Alice can die as well. Though even if you do succeed here, I never found this to be that satisfying of an outcome, especially in comparison to the Canadian border path, where there they have a final checkpoint to pass, during which Rose and Adam are also there for some reason, along with Jerry, who shows up somehow. But here we get this final moment at the border desk where you can sacrifice a character as a distraction to get through, but none of those outcomes to me feel right. Though if one of them did, it would be for Cara to sacrifice herself, but even then, the outcome I do feel like is the most satisfying is where everyone survives and the guards let you through, despite knowing that you are androids, due to seeing Marcus's protesting in the news, which to me is the outcome that accompanies the game's themes the best. Though again, this is all just one half of Cara's potential ending, where had she gotten captured, we instead get what is potentially the most depressing outcome I've ever seen from any David Cage game, who again has a knack for creating the most melodramatic situations possible, but here we will see Cara and Alice being taken to a recall center, which again is blatantly supposed to parallel Nazi extermination camps, which again is a section that is so over the top, but that really doesn't change how downright depressing this all is, to see Cara and Alice have to deactivate their skins, obviously dehumanizing them, and we see them getting separated and spend most of the chapter trying to reconvene, to where along the way you can also just straight up be killed. Also, you can have your final interactions with most of the androids that Cara had met along the way, only for us to lead up to Cara and Alice entering the recycling machine, which is again just a gas chamber, where they will end up dying a really somber death, being an extremely sour way to end this game. Though, if you do end up getting this outcome, there is another shot for them to possibly survive, where if Marcus succeeds in his protests, Alice and Cara will then conveniently be saved just in time, though otherwise this is an extremely dark ending to their story, which is sadly the ending I got on my initial playthrough. Then let's talk about Conor's role here, where again he does have two separate paths based on whether or not he is a deviant, whereas a non-deviant Conor will still be hunting Marcus down, setting up a vantage point to snipe him from afar, only for Hank, if he is alive, to attempt to stop him, which amounts to a fight where either one of them can die, which I do think is an extremely underwhelming outcome to their relationship, though even if Conor does survive here, this does delay Conor long enough to miss this opportunity, which in itself I guess isn't a bad outcome for Hank, to have essentially sacrificed himself to save the leader of the deviants. Though something I do find weird is that if Hank isn't alive by this point, he's replaced by Captain Allen, who is this random character from the first mission, which obviously is just not as impactful. Though again, really, this is all just a pretty bad outcome. While with a deviant Conor, we do have him working with Marcus and him going off on his own to Cyberlife in an attempt to recruit more androids to their side, again being a better outcome for Conor's character, with him now using his insider position to help the deviants, leading to a heist-style section of Conor breaking into Cyberlife, only for him to be confronted by another copy of himself who is holding Hank hostage, leading to a great conclusion to the Conor-Hank relationship, where it is Conor's knowledge of Hank's personal life that allows Hank to recognize which one is the real Conor and take the new Conor down, feeling like a nice payoff to their relationship, though at the same time obviously you can just straight up fail these sections and this leads to Hank killing Conor, which is not as satisfying. But with the right choices here, I do feel like this ends up being a really nice outcome for both Conor and Hank, with them succeeding in helping Marcus by sending him back up. But now let's talk about Marcus, and again, the main plot of this game is still the Marcus storyline, with this chapter revolving around the final confrontation with the humans, which again, Marcus can approach with either a demonstration or a revolution, where the demonstration path leads to Perkins arriving to negotiate, where if you accept the deal, Perkins immediately betrays you, killing Marcus, which is largely underwhelming, though declining it leads to a battle anyway, playing out similarly to the revolution path, though that obviously has Marcus taking the initiative, though this route has much longer action sequences and way more opportunities for Marcus to die, though if Simon or North are still alive at this point, they will end up offering their hearts to him in the chance that he gets taken out, giving him a second chance, which is kind of weird, though. Again, like Marcus dying in this section just feels very anticlimactic, And if Conor doesn't become a deviant, you will have a final fight between the two during this chapter, which I can see how this can be thematically satisfying to see these two androids on the polar opposite ends of the spectrum clash here. Though again, if Conor just wins this fight, it does lead to this being very unsatisfying, and the same goes for the outcomes involving you blowing up Detroit, which is just funny that's even a possibility. So again, really for me, I do feel like the demonstration outcome is the optimal one in my eyes, where despite Marcus losing the battle, you are given the opportunity before they shoot to change the public's minds, where here you can either sing, which is a very memeable moment, or kiss North if you have romanced her along the way, which these actions will show the public the android's humanity, making the soldier stand down and effectively convincing the president to give androids their freedom. Again, in my eyes, fulfilling the themes in the most satisfying way, making it so that it is the android's humanity that wins them this battle, with this feeling like the only Marcus outcome that fully satisfies the game's themes. I will say that no matter how this game concludes, I do find the ending to this game pretty abrupt, where I do feel like we are missing this kind of like epilogue scene in this game, a scene to kind of show us how the androids move on from this, or instead all it is that we see the conflict concluded and hear that the androids have won, but don't really see what that truly means. And I think we are missing a piece of this game's conclusion, though not something that is downright detrimental to the overall experience. And really that ends up being the entirety of Detroit Become Human, which again I do think is genuinely the best Quantic Dream game made up to this point. But as I talked about in this video, there are still a number of flaws, many of which come from what you would expect from a David Cage game. Having said, I do think within this game, David Cage has improved upon his writing, being one of the most impressive games in how they handle player choice and how they handle this wide range of branching storylines, particularly towards the end of the game, where there are so many possible outcomes to where it's simply just overwhelming to try to see all those scenarios. I mean, this game is essentially Heavy Rain on steroids, taking the initial premise of that game and one-upping it in every conceivable way, to where despite its flaws, I do genuinely find this to be one of the best interactive drama games to ever be released, despite my minor hiccups with it. There we go, and those are my thoughts on Detroit Become Human 5 years after its initial release, which does conclude my series on the modern Quantic Dream games. Now technically I could do a video on Indigo Prophecy / Fahrenheit at some point down the road, though really that's a possibility for the distant future, but outside of that, just expect more of the same types of retrospectives down the road. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.